Thank you to all of you coming into the webinar right now. So glad you're here. David Hicks as well is the author of The Stones Cry Out is here, and we're going to have a conversation together and with you. And that means we want to invite you to participate. And the way you'll be able to do that is by dropping a question into that little Q&A box you see there at the bottom of your screen. That's the best way to ensure that your question gets addressed. So we encourage you to use that. You can also use the chat box. Um, Normally, when teaching a class, we would not say you should be doing this at all. But for this kind of webinar, we do welcome you to make some comments and interact with both David and me and with others on the call in that chat box. And occasionally I'll glance at it. But if I'm going to address a question, uh, I certainly will be looking at that Q&A box to make sure that your questions get answered. So let's start with just saying hello. If you wouldn't mind going to the chat box and giving us your name, telling us where you live and reside, and just for fun, tell us a place that you have lived in that you really have enjoyed. It might be right where you are now, but maybe you got a chance to live in another place that you loved. Let's hear of a place that you have lived, even for a short time, that you have loved. So please give us your name, tell us where you are right now, and the place that you love. And I'm gonna do the same. Uh, Liz has lived on Crete for 18 months. Amazing. Cornelia, Singapore for 4 years. How great. Tammy got to live in Yokosuka, Japan. Joy Lynn, both northern and southern China. Jonica, so far she's at Vancouver Island, BC. Not a bad place to be living, from what I hear. Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining. Sylvia, Wilson Hill Academy teacher, currently living in New York City. Spent some time in West Virginia, where the doors never needed to be locked. Crystal from Beulah, Michigan. Mm-hmm. I got to visit the Upper Peninsula one time, loved it, and heard that you can drink the water, which I found astounding. Well, thank you so much for coming, and I think I'll make that an opening question just to kind of break the ice with our friend and author David Hicks. David, you've lived many places, and so I wonder, as you survey your past and mind, tell us about one beautiful place that you have loved, and why.
Well, if I was to name my favorite place, it's where I live right now.
Ah,
Uh, but yes, I've been blessed with living in some wonderful places. Maybe one that comes to mind when I was my second year in graduate school, I lived in a manor house in England in a kind of quirky way, but Yarnton Manor was my home, and it had a massive art gallery, many bedrooms, servants, et cetera, and I was tending it from a man named Maitland, who was an anthropologist who had a double first at Cambridge and had an opportunity to live with a tribe in the
hmm.
Yucatan Peninsula. And so he needed someone to step into his palatial digs and make sure that the servants were showing up and doing what they're supposed to do. So I spent my last year living at Oxford, living in that kind of a situation. My classmates all assumed that I was fantastically wealthy. And I didn't bother disabusing them of that notion. I felt like a young Jay Gatsby in the middle of this whole thing. But it was fun. To give you a sense of it, the Great Hall was so large that we cleared the furniture out and would play stadium soccer in the Great Hall. I don't know that Maitland would have approved, but we had a great time.
Oh, so you cite The Great Gatsby, but I'm thinking of Brideshead Revisited. Uh,
Mm.
this was your Brideshead.
It was, yeah, it was. As I joked with my children who visited it later with me, I said, in that sense, life after that was all downhill. You don't want that. You don't want that experience when you're too young because you can never sort of ascend to that level of all affluence. But nor do you really want to. What you find out living like that is that after a couple of weeks, it's just home.
Hmm.
You come home, kick off your shoes, put something on the gramophone, open your book, read. It really doesn't, it's just another place.
So this is as good a portal to enter our conversation as other, just beautiful places and beautiful buildings. Some architects like Christopher Alexander comes to mind, says that, what we build is really, it's a sacred and religious act as much as a domestic act. And our buildings end up representing what we think of the cosmos and the transcendent. And we don't just want a domicile, we want a home. And our homes are kind of like set apart sacred places for us when you can use the word home and hearth and have that really mean something. And so I'll just let that kind of be an opening concept question because you have loved building. You have thought about buildings, you've thought about architecture, and I know from reading your book and talking to you that you understand how architecture is also a metaphor or analogy for a life well lived. And one of the kind of controlling analogies you use in your book is one of building, of constructing a wall stone by stone. So, and here you are sitting in this home that you've also curated and built, and that's its own really remarkable story. And that's in the video, by the way, that Jay mentioned before we turned the camera on. We were able to visit you and have you talk about the building of the house you're in now and film it and show it so that while you're telling, we were able to show. So, Courtney or Jay, if you could just drop in a link to that video. Those of you watching will enjoy that 20-minute little mini documentary where through David's home, he ends up talking about what it means to be a blessed and educated human being, essentially. So, David, I'm going to turn it over to you. When you think about buildings and architecture and constructing your own home, how is that related to your own vision for what it means to be an educated person?
Uh, it's a big question and also complicated
Hmm.
because I didn't grow up in a grand home. My family was wonderful but rather poor, and we moved from place to place and lived in some pretty humble places. Um, I think being exposed to great spaces was was good for me. Then we go back to the sort of classical idea that there is a space, even a dimension of a space that is right for a human being. And other dimensions might be bold, might be creative, might be whatever, but they're not perfect for a human being. And of course, modern architecture probably wholeheartedly rejects that idea. But I became sort of in love with it when my brother and I were contemplating a translation of Vitruvius's books on architecture. And so that's why I designed the house I have. And I've lived in a few houses like that in Italy. And it really does it changes how you feel as a human being. When you walk into this space, it's like, this is right. This is so wonderful. It's so inspiring. It's so beautiful. It's just where I want to be. Um, and And there is something definitely, let me just transition to a completely different sort of idea, but this will kind of capture it. Uh, my church, we're building a new church right now in Bozeman. We've outgrown the church we built 10 years ago. It's a wonderful God-sent story. I was walking through the bones of it as it's being constructed the other day, and I noticed all the windows are arched windows, all of them.
Mm.
And there were a lot of them. And I was thinking about something I read years ago about that. When you make a window that is got a flat top, that's where it puts an end to your vision. That's your vision. And it is a kind of, to go back to the Stones book, it's an earth only view.
Mm.
When you make a window with an arch, as they did in the ancient world, you're not only looking at the world, but you're looking at the gods. You're
Mm.
looking at the heavens. It and it's you're not capturing all of it, but you are in a sense capturing all of it, because that dome, that roundedness, goes on forever. It invites you to sort of look up and imagine what's beyond.
Mm.
Just that simple idea is, to me, such an evocative idea. And of course, the trouble with ideas is once they're implanted in your brain, you can't look at a window the same way, right? So it's a mixed blessing.
So everyone behind you, I know, is now, I mean, everyone's looking behind you, I know,
Yeah.
seeing that arched window, all right? So you're living your doctrine. You built this house thinking about that. And so maybe we can keep this kind of on the table as kind of a metaphor we return to, but let's go to your book. You wrote a book that was also trying to lift people's gaze heavenward. And you wrote a book about myths, um, which for some watching or listening might think, well, why would a classical Christian educator want to write a book about what it means to be a blessed human being and use myths as the primary way of coming in? So could you, for our audience, explain what you mean by myth, and why was it, you think, a legitimate choice for describing what it means to be a blessed, happy, educated person?
Yeah, well, thank you, Chris. One of the core ideas of the book is that we, we all consciously or subconsciously are telling ourselves a story about reality,
Hmm.
what it is to be real, how we came to be here, how we fit in, or why we don't. Uh, the book is really about those kind of narratives, and those are, I have a much more specific definition of myth in my book that you can read about,
Mhm.
but I'd rather just sort of address it on a more broad basis. A myth is a story. It's not a story that is um, what we would call scientifically or factually accurate. Even science has its myth. We all know the science myth. Darwin had a huge influence on it. The quantum scientists now are changing that myth significantly, more than people, I think, in the general public are aware. Um, and I touch on that a little bit in the book as well. But there's a story, and what I believe is really one of the core ideas of my book, and the reason I wrote it, is I believe what's causing so much cognitive dissonance, so much conflict, so much division in the world right now, is that we're not agreeing on the myth. We have, the religious myth, which I base on the three proto myths in Genesis. We have that myth of reality, what it looks to be real, what is real. And then we have other myths that have come into being, especially since the Enlightenment, so-called, since Nietzsche, and then the most recent myth, which I try to describe because I think most people are not even aware that it's a myth. It's the myth of the imagined self. But I hope that in my description, people will immediately recognize, oh yeah, that is what's going on here. We are imagining ourselves. And I trace that back, of course, to Descartes' cogito, which if the average person reads the cogito, I think, therefore I am, well, what does that mean? It's like, ooh, that's kind of a
Mhm.
gnomic utterance. But really what it means is that I'm creating myself. I think, therefore I am. I go from this kind of action to a sort of ontological point. I exist because I think. Those things that are not thinking don't exist. If you can't think, you don't exist. And of course, Descartes took it to extreme view. He said, I don't even know if Chris Perrin, if you exist, because I can't get inside your head and see you thinking. So I'm the only one who exists here. And that is a hugely arrogant, solipsistic idea. But the whole modern enterprise, I try to argue, is all based upon this piece of circular reasoning. Because the other thing I say about the cogito, I think, therefore I am, is wait a second. When you said I think, you already assumed that you are because you said I. So you haven't done anything. You haven't really made any sort of profound statement. You just made a kind of obvious one. One equals one. And and yet we have built a whole civilization, so to speak, or tried to build on this piece of foolishness. And,
Mhm.
uh, and I'm sure there are philosophers who are much more adept at philosophy than I am who will take issue with that and will try to argue something else about what the cogito really means. But even if they succeed in terms of describing it as a professional philosopher might, they still haven't dismissed what is the obvious meaning of that statement and the way we have in the popular mind interpreted it.
Mm.
So
And
anyway,
it certainly emphasizes privileges reason, right?
well, yeah,
He's not saying I imagine, therefore I am, or I feel, therefore I am. He says I think. And so the kind of disembodied mind, it becomes a kind of Gnostic concept eventually. Our bodies, our buildings, how important are they really? So the whole idea of us being sensory creatures who also smell the world and feel the world and hear the world gets downplayed, and which leads maybe to a distinction that you make in the book, and you made it also in Norms and Nobility, your great book on education that also needs to be recommended and probably put in the chat box. One of the reasons, to those of you listening or viewing, that David is is on this call and so well known among classical educators is because of that book he wrote in the 80s called Norms and Nobility. And what was your subtitle to Norms and Nobility? Treatise?
a treatise on
Treatise
education.
on Education. Um, and this book itself was kind of dumbfounded even David what happened with it. And so it's kind of mythic in classical Christian education circles, Norms and Nobility. And for those who haven't heard that story, I think before we dive into the Stones Cry Out, could you just share a little bit about how Norms and Nobility came about and how you found yourself therefore on a new career path on account of that book?
Yeah, well, if I could say this, part of the problem with the book is that I wrote it to myself. I didn't have an audience at that time. I didn't
Mhm.
know there weren't any classical Christian educators that I knew about at that time. And I had just finished a year working for the Whitehead Foundation in Atlanta, living at the Westminster schools there. They
Mhm.
had given me a grant for a year to look at American secondary education and to propose improvements to it. They were Beaufort Jones was then the director of the Whitehead Foundation, and he was under under Kennedy. He was his education person when education was inside the HEW.
Mhm.
And so I visited a lot of schools. I thought a lot. I read constantly that year. It was a very intense year for me. Uh,
Mhm.
and at the end of the year, I made my presentation, and it flopped. It was like, wait, that's not what we had in mind. I think
Mhm.
what folks had in mind, and I made it to a lot of teachers too, is well, we want to know how we can sort of adjust or improve what we're doing and make it more effective or whatever. And and I had come to the conclusion that we were just heading in the wrong direction, and any improvement just accelerates us in the wrong direction. And that what we have done is we've jettisoned 2,500 years of tradition and knowledge and wisdom and experience from education, and we're buying into all these theories that are coming out of the academy, and uh, our whole system is set up to create theories because that's what is rewarded. You know, I come up with a new idea, we're going to trot it out, we'll put it in the schools, we'll put it in the textbooks, we'll do whatever, and we don't find out until years later, oh, that wasn't a very good idea, that didn't really work. Uh, and so another generation of school children are dumbed down or missed. But what they really miss is their whole heritage, their whole classical heritage. And the teachers are missing the same thing. They're not getting the tools to do what, you know, as Dorothy Sayers wrote about, they haven't been given the tools to teach children what they need. So anyway, that was the basis of my book. Now, at that point, I was unemployed. I was working as a carpenter's assistant in rural Georgia. It was a pretty unprepossessing start for a young man who had just gotten married and was expecting his first child.
Mm.
But I decided, you know, I'm going to lose this whole year if I don't sit down and write up my conclusions. So that's Norms and Nobility.
Mm.
And I sent it off to a good friend of mine, George Zimmer, who was an editor at Prager in New York. And I sent the manuscript. And I said, George, I don't know. I have no idea how to get this published or if it's even publishable, but I've done this work, and would you look at it and suggest someone I might send it to? And George read it. He's a great friend. He's still a great friend. He's still a
Mm.
great friend. And he said, he got back to me, he said, yeah, I'm sorry to say that, you know, this is not publishable. No one's publishing treatises these days. And besides which, my company is basically a group of we publish the work of social science academics, anthropologists, economists, sociologists, etc. Your book is it's pretty much an unsustained attack on social science. I just don't think we're going to want to publish this book. And so that was the end of it. And then about maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, I got another call from him and said, this is surprising me even more than it will you, but our publisher actually wants to publish it. But it's going to be a very small edition because no one's going to buy this book. And I was thrilled. Wow, I can't believe I'm publishing. I was still in my 20s, I think, when he called me. And I thought maybe I do have a future beyond carpentry. So anyway, the book got published, but the irony of the whole thing is, you know, as you know, these publishing houses, I don't know how it is today, but back in the day, every year, the American Library Association puts gives a top award for every book in a category: anthropology, sociology, economics, history, all these categories. Education is one of the categories. And that year, of all things, Norms and Nobility won the ALA award in education. And it was the only book at Prager that won that award. And according to George, it's very funny because the other thing is about the ALA awards which makes them nice, is that we have thousands of libraries in America, and librarians, you know, they can't buy the thousands of books being published, so they just buy off that list. And so the top book, they just buy it. So my book went, I guess, from a printing size of about 500 to several thousand because all these libraries wanted the book. Anyway, that's the end of that story. But what's nice about it is that it has stayed in print, even though sometimes charged at an exorbitant price, all that time, because the homeschoolers sort of discovered the book. So I used to get little emails or letters from homeschooling parents wanting to talk a little bit about it. And then Andrew Kern and you and I mean, several others have just taken this whole classical Christian idea, um, which I had never dreamt. I had never imagined it would happen, and now it seems to be just exploding everywhere. Everybody's talking about classical Christian education, partly because the public schools have literally become so toxic, especially to our faith. Um, no one really cared whether they were classical or not, but taking a sort of antagonistic view, and just that the simple thing is just sort of cutting God out of any discussion. I mean, from a Christian perspective, you can't talk about reality without talking about God. I mean, you
Yeah.
may reject him, but and not only that, from an educator's point of view, how can you read books that were written or thoughts that were thought before, let's say, 1800, that didn't have God at the center of them? So what
That's right.
that means is it means when we're teaching, well, we've got to just either teach very modern stuff, a lot of it which is just, pablum, or if we teach the old things, we we need to try to avoid that whole discussion in our schools. It's even on the face of it, even if you're not a believer, the whole proposition is insane.
So,
So,
that comment reminds me of something you do in both books. You argue that what you're seeking to do is to describe reality and to articulate a vision of the human life and of education that helps us to come to know what is real. And it may seem ironic to some that in the second book you would use story or myth as one of the primary things we have to reassess and get right if we're going to understand what is real. And if we don't understand what is real, you argue then we're lost. And there are competing narratives out there for how you ought to think about what the cosmos actually is and what you are. And when these things are wrong, we're not living in the real world, and therefore we experience, the great pain because of that misalignment. So I'd like to ask you this question. In Norms of Nobility, you talk about the distinction between mythos and logos, and you point out how these things need to be harmonized, and there's a way of doing that. But in this book, The Stones Cry Out, you return especially to mythos, and you describe how mythos can can be beautiful and actually align ourselves to the world that our Creator has actually made, but also the way in which it can be corrupted to distort and disorient us. So could you maybe talk a little bit about the relationship between logos and mythos, and then tell us why you were compelled to write The Stones Cry Out and what it is you were seeking to achieve?
um, well, Chris, I mean, you're right. I'm really trying to uh, I'm really trying to find uh, to. I think we all need to be situated in reality. We can't live our lives without knowing what is real or what is true. And the search for truth, of course, has gone on for thousands of years. But again, I feel that we've taken the Enlightenment, which did some wonderful things, but it took us in the wrong direction. It gave us a bad narrative.
Hmm.
And we're now sort of pushing that narrative so hard that uh, Ayn Rand, not someone I often quote, but Ayn Rand said in her essay on selfishness, she said, you can evade reality, but you can't evade the consequences of evading reality. And I think that is what we've done. We've been evading reality. We've invited our own narratives, alternative narratives for what is real. But the hens are all coming home to roost now. Now we're seeing a very divided culture, a civilization that is spiraling down, young people who are lost and confused, uh, and we're at one another's throats over things that we shouldn't be at, fighting over. Um, because our narratives are now so different, we can't agree on what's real, what's good, what's beautiful, what's true. And that's, in a broadest sense, that's kind of what the book is about. That
Could you then um, list the six myths and kind of tell us about your setup of the book? The subtitle of the book is Reflections on the Myths We Live By. And you argue that we're going to live by a myth no matter what. You're going to end up choosing one because you need meaning, right? You could try to become the solipsist or, the cynic who just really believes everything's absurd. But it's very hard to live your life that way. So the great majority of us are going to believe in a myth. We believe in a story. Why these six? And how did you set the book up to do the work you wanted it to do?
yeah, look, good. One of the things I want the book to do, a lot of people are, if they read the book, they're going to suddenly discover, oh, that's my myth. Because it's not like you walk down the street and ask John Q. Public, what's your myth? He's going, what are you talking about? But in fact, most of us are living myths that we are really not conscious of because we're just
Hmm.
following the crowd. We're just doing what our education told us to do, what our family is doing. There are many people who live the Christian myth who aren't really aware that they're living the Christian myth. They're just doing it because that's how they were raised. In the 50s, I would guess that many people were living a a, um, a Christian mythos without even caring. I talked to an Orthodox Christian the other day, a cradle Christian, someone who was raised in Romania, and occasionally they go to church, and uh, they seem to be completely at a loss about why that the resurrection actually occurred, and what the significance of the resurrection was. And anyone who's been in an Orthodox liturgy is like, "Are you kidding me? How can you possibly not know?" But that's so the first thing is there are myths. Now, what I've tried to do is say, really, basically, if you boil all the myths down, there are really only four. They're the religious myth, there's the scientific myth, there's the rational myth, and there's what I call the myth of the imagined self. And these myths do overlap and they compete with one another sometimes, or they contradict themselves. But what I'm also trying to show, Chris, is for those who have uh, bought into the religious myth or dismissed it, it's actually a myth, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. It makes sense of everything, even though it's pretty fabulous. I mean, if you just look at the myth on its own terms, you go, that's ridiculous. I mean, how
Hmm.
could that possibly be? But
Hmm.
the thing is if you really explore the myth in terms of your experience of life or all the other myths that are out there, well, actually, it's got its arms around everything. The other myths don't do that.
Yeah.
Uh, and then I go into the other myths, the myth of science, the myth of reason, the myth of the imagined self. And what I try to point out is how
Mm.
flawed these myths are. That they are just, I mean, the myth of reason, for example, there's no there's no there's no way to say, well, reason says this is the right myth. That's ridiculous. Reason doesn't say anything like that. Reason builds on a presupposition which can't be proven. It has to be there. And then you can build on it logically, and reason can do that. It's a wonderful tool for doing that. But people act as if reason is pointing them in one direction. What I try to do on the chapter on the book on reason is show that's ridiculous. Reason is the last thing you want to put your faith in. You want to put your faith in a presupposition. And unfortunately, it's got to be something that you can't prove.
Yeah. It's just, we're just talking this morning here with my extended family are together, and someone was reporting a student who was at a secular one of the Ivies, and it was visiting one of the Christian colleges, visiting a friend, and she attended class, and she was hearing about a Christian worldview in some fashion, and she said to the professor, "Well, I'm an empiricist. I'm an atheist empiricist. I don't believe anything if it can't be demonstrated empirically with evidence." And the professor had the presence of mind to say, "Well, can you demonstrate that very sentence, that very claim you've made? And she paused. She put her, her hands to her face, and she said, "Well, no, I can't." He said, "That's worth reflecting on."
Hmm. Yeah.
Then the story apparently was short, and she came back next semester. She left the school, and she had become a theist. So there's yeah, there are these hidden assumptions, and we have to turn to something beyond just using our reason in the void. So I'd like to read a passage from your book about myth, and then have you describe the first three proto myths for our viewers and listeners. And to those of you listening or viewing, this might be a good time to start formulating some questions, because as he shares these first three proto myths, you might have questions about them that you can put in the box. And then after that, we'll have some discussion about it. And you can guess that I'm going to also ask him to describe those three counter myths or secular myths that are so prevalent. He's already mentioned them: reason, imagined self, and the empirical science, rationalism. So I'll read this quote from you. This is you describing mythos. Let's be clear from the start about what we mean and don't mean by myth, or in Greek, mythos. A myth is not a story that is untrue, as some believe, nor is it a story as others believe, that is a historical account of something that actually happened once upon a time, nor is it a primitive tale unworthy of belief. There are modern myths as well as ancient ones that intelligent, well-educated people have put their faith in. For the purposes of this book and the wall that I have been building in my mind, a myth is a story told in symbolic language, describing historically improbable and unrepeatable manifestations of continually repeated eternal truths about the nature of reality. This reminds me of Flannery O'Connor saying that, a good story is a true lie.
Hmm.
Story that you don't have to believe the literal details of, but it's telling us something very true about human human experience, the cosmos itself. So there's a great definition. I'll just read the last line again. A myth is a story told in symbolic language, describing historically improbable and unrepeatable manifestations of continually repeated eternal truths about the nature of reality. So as you go to the first myth, please tell us what the continually repeatable eternal truth is in the first proto myth.
Well, it starts with one word, God.
Hmm.
It's the creation myth, right? In the beginning, actually, it says, in the beginning,
Mhm.
God created the heaven and the earth. That is the most startling. I mean, we're so soaked in this stuff that we don't realize that is the most startling original claim you can imagine. First, until in 1928, I think, when Einstein published his theory, the whole idea of in the beginning was nonsense to science. There was no beginning. This is just nonsense. So
Mhm.
it's already making a claim that until, you know, within the lifetime of some people, science rejected, but it's in the beginning. Okay, so there's a beginning. God. Wait, God. What is this? Who is God? And he's the creator. We know that from that line. And he created heaven and earth. So the first myth is God is the protagonist. He's the only thing there. He's acting. He's choosing. He's creating. He's speaking. He's the only thing in the myth of creation. Then suddenly it's interrupted at the very beginning of chapter 2. By the way, if people are interested in reading this book, the first thing they should do is read the first 3 chapters of Genesis. You'll find it a lot more fun if you sort of have done your own thinking about those first 3 chapters before you come to my thinking about it, because then you can disagree with me. Because Hicks is just crazy. That's not what it was meant, but that's what I want you to do. Read it and think about it. And what I'm trying to do in those chapters on the proto myths, the 3 proto myths, is show you how one person, me, thinks about these things. But if you read others, theologians, the church fathers, they may not, I try to track the church fathers because I think they're the most brilliant interpreters of those myths. but there are others. And so anyway, second myth, the garden myth, the myth of the garden. Well, wait, now we're starting in this massive, infinite void, this cosmos where suddenly light appears and this little thing starts growing, right? And God's there somewhere, but we can't define him, we can't see him, we can't know anything about him other than what he's doing through his energies, right? Second myth, no, we're shrunk down to this tiny little spot. It's a garden. It's a garden with two people God created at the very end of the first myth. And those two people, Adam and Eve, Adam, by the way, which Hebrew meaning man, Eve, which probably comes from a root word meaning giver of life. Okay, so right away, to me, the tip off is we're not talking about two people. It might have been two people, but these people stand for the human race. They stand for the beginning of who we are. Whether God created them like snapping his fingers and bam, there they were, or he used some sort of teleology over time, and they suddenly, and of course, my argument is suddenly they became conscious, self-conscious. That's what I think the myth is about, the birth of consciousness. By the way, those of you who are interested in philosophy or reading, will know that tons of books have been written about the birth of consciousness. Everybody wants to know, where did this thing come from? And we have no idea. We just don't know. Okay. So I'm saying, look, here's a myth that you've had all along, which actually presents that problem and answers it. Now, you may not like the answer, but that's the answer. To me, the whole thing about Eve choosing to eat from this tree is her birth of consciousness. Suddenly, it's a realization, wow, I'm in a moral universe. I have to look at things. Already I'm feeling desire. Already I'm sensing beauty, because that's clearly in the myth. And now I'm going to now I'm coming on a knowledge that some things are good and some things are bad. Heaven, God, chooses those things. And I am being urged to choose those things and to reject these other things. If you think about it, that is a startling, if my dog, Atticus, where are you? If my dog were suddenly to wake up in the morning and think, oh, some things are good and some things are bad, and I've got to do the good things and not the bad. I mean, he would be completely different. He'd be in a different universe. It would be such an explosion of his cognitive abilities that, he probably couldn't handle it. So to me, that's the second myth, the garden myth. And by the way, in the garden myth, the protagonists are humans, not God. And they are given the power, the godlike power that God had in the first myth, to choose. They choose. God gave them that power. You choose. What are you going to do? Eat of this tree? Or are you going to choose me? Are you going to believe me when I tell you that's a bad thing? Or are you going to say, I'm an empirical person. I've got to experience that, right? And that's who we are. We would, it's very hard for us. But if you think of the God character here, and you think of our modern discussions about AI, I mean, yes, of course, God is creative. He created us in his image and likeness. So what does that mean? Well, what do we know about God? He is radically free. He can do whatever he wants to do. And if we're created in his image and likeness, we're going to be radically free. We can do whatever we want to do, in spite of what the modern theorists say, oh, we're not free. We're all determined. To me, that's just poppycock. They don't live their lives that way. They still make decisions and change their minds and do all of that. But in this, we're getting ahead now, but we've pushed ourselves so far in that wormhole of science that now we're making stupid statements. And as you earlier on said, Chris, we're moving into Gnosticism. We're moving into a situation, and this is what reason did to us, the myth of reason. The mind is all there is. The body, forget that. That doesn't really matter. It's the mind. Well, all of the monotheistic religions, not just Christianity, Judaism, Islam, it completely rejects dualism, this idea that and Gnosticism, this idea that the mind is completely in control. The body is actually evil, according to the Gnostics. It's bad stuff.
Mhm.
Uh, that's all rejected. The body in the proto myths, in the creation myth, and in the all three of the myths, the body is good. God created as good. He created as beautiful. He didn't just create us with heads. And
Mhm.
in fact, according to the garden myth, watch out for that head. It's not a very dependable item. You know,
Mhm.
reason, one of the objections you might have to the book is I just, I really attack reason consistently through the whole thing because reason is really treacherous. Of course, I think the best line in the whole book, if I can boast about one line, which just sort of comes to you when you're writing, Luther said, reason is a whore.
Mhm.
And I was like, well, really? Why would? And then I
Mhm.
thought, oh my goodness, yeah, reason is it says you can lie down for an hour with any presupposition and fall in love with her,
Mhm.
but the hour's up. You know, reason will allow you to sort of look at a presupposition and build on it some wonderful little thing you've got out there, a theory or whatever. But in the end, it's led you in the wrong direction because you started from the wrong point, the presupposition.
Yeah,
Anyway,
in this context, you mentioned you qualify reason, and you say I think you use the phrase in the void, or reason operating autonomously without presupposing the lordship of a creator God, who's even given you your reason, and therefore whom your reason needs to be in harmony with. So we have this kind of we have this gift of reason, but we forget that it was a gift. We forget that there's a giver and that it has its limits. Like I'm thinking of Pascal, who says, the heart has its reasons, which reason cannot know. And so Descartes was one of the, brilliant scientists. He's one of these scientists who was a Christian who thought my thinking has its limits. And he understood the need for harmony. So it seems that one of the things your book did for me is that it was a restoration of harmony. It was a kind of ordering or orienting of reason and using our senses to know reality.
mhm.
Could you mention the third proto myth and tell us why you felt compelled to include that one as well?
Well, they all happen together, sort of, and they all happen within the same family. The
Mhm.
third one is what I call the murder myth,
Mhm.
and it to me it's a really it speaks to some of the questions that were raised by the garden myth, and it also um, shows the effects of eating that fruit. No, of course I see that as, but it shows the effects of discovering good and bad, and it shows the consciousness of that, and it shows the effects of rejecting God. And
Mhm.
Cain, who certainly in the story, I mean, he knows what God wants. God's really clear with him, but he does the most heinous thing. He murders his younger brother. Okay, I mean, you can't even imagine a more horrific thing. Uh, and yet he does it, and he has so many of the characteristics of modern, urban, secular man. I do some quoting from Plato as well as to describe sort of secular man and how screwed up we are, but we'll all recognize ourselves in Plato in that. And we should recognize ourselves in Cain. And what I'm saying about Cain is he really is the hero of our civilization. He's really the prototypical human being as presented by the biblical mythos. But at the same time, it also shows us right at the very beginning, man is worshiping. I mean, it's the most basic instinct that man has is to worship God.
Mhm.
And and they're both bringing their gifts to God. Worship, what I try to argue there is clearly worship, the core of worship is giving, trying to give back to God, because it's an acknowledgement that he's given us everything. I'm living, I can't live an hour without being thankful, or less. I mean,
Mm.
there's so much to be thankful for. Of course, there's so much blessedness that happens to us all the time, and yet we end up taking it all for granted, with every breath. The dying words of St. Anthony the Great, according to Athanasius. He told his followers, so they're gathering around him and he's expiring, he said, "Let Christ be the air you breathe."
Mm.
To
Mm.
me, the best dying words that were ever uttered. And
Mm.
but it's because it's so powerful. Um, but anyway, the murder myth is one which kind of puts us where it moves us right up to the present. I mean,
Mm.
who is Cain? He's the founder of cities. He goes off. Hey, he does pretty well. He's got a big family. He's successful. He's living without God, and he's doing just fine. Thank you very much. Well, that's where we are, right in the secular city, and yet, right at the very beginning. That's why I say these myths are so true. They're so, we're living these myths, even though we've dismissed them, and we've chosen to live other myths that have tremendous flaws in them. And that's what the rest of the book is about.
So these three proto myths teach what we repeatedly encounter as eternal truths.
Yeah.
The result of the fall, the way using reason in the void, that self-aggrandizing ambition that is even willing to kill someone in order to have what you would have. Um, so I think you do a great job of unpacking this in some in some ways that clarify it as a myth on its own terms, but then you start describing in various ways. You always turn to practical applications of how these myths are being embodied and repeated, like they actually tell you what human experience is like. So I'm thinking this just to mention another commonly known myth that is outside of the church, outside of the Bible, the myth of Icarus flying too high.
Mhm.
Don't fly too high, or the wax on your wings is going to melt. You're going to fall to the earth. Okay, we know this myth. We live it every day, or we've experienced it regularly. Um, don't elevate yourself. Don't boast. Be careful of your own ambition. Listen to your older friends who've been around the block. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, watch out for your technology.
Yeah,
Because, who is Daedalus, the father of Icarus?
yeah.
Daedalus is a
Great.
scientist. He
Yeah.
is the premier scientist of Minos, of Minoan. He designed the labyrinth, where they threw the Minotaur in it. Okay. He designed it. He was so brilliant a scientist, he designed a labyrinth that not even he could figure the way out of.
Mm.
Think of our AI engineers who are saying, hey, this stuff is going to destroy humanity. They can't even figure a way out of it,
Yeah.
right? But they're brilliant. And so what happens? Well, young Icarus, the younger generation, they really say, he builds, but the scientist gives them a technology. What is the technology? We'll put wings on you. We'll make you out of osier branches and wax, and you can fly away with me. We'll do this. But the young guy says, "Oh wow, this technology is really cool. There are some things I really," and he uses it irresponsibly, and as you say, he drowns in the Icarian Sea. But the yeah, I mean the whole thing is just so full of that, and why people, of course, by not teaching young people these myths, these truths, these older books, these things, you're asking them now to swim in an ocean an inch deep. I mean, they have nothing.
Yeah.
And Chris, there's one thing while we're having this discussion,
Yeah. Yeah.
a really radical thing that I wanted to read from the book, because people are going to think, "Oh, this book." I want people to understand how completely extremist I am in writing in some of these ideas. I'm talking about, what I'm saying is, after I talk about all this reasonableness, I'm saying actually that the Gospels support a really straightforward test of reasonableness.
Hmm.
Jesus condemns the fig tree for not bearing fruit and offers this as an example of how to judge everything that flows from our actions, ideas, and theories. Quote, by their fruits you will know them, Matthew. If they're yielding poor results, they deserve to be, quote, cut down and thrown in the fire, end of quote. This is Jesus speaking.
Mhm.
Yet it would be foolish to imagine that the rabbi shared our materialist mindset and was talking simply about ideas and ideologies that improve our material conditions and make our lives more comfortable. What might he have in mind? Paul answers this question in his letter to the Galatians. The test of a theory's reasonableness, here's where I get really out there, is the fruit it yields. Does it promote the spiritual benefits of, quote, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control?
Yeah.
Now, in a reality like ours, based on earth without heaven, this must seem a weird test of reasonableness. Can we imagine such a test being suggested by critical theorists, white supremacists, economists, political scientists, Marxists, or libertarians? I mean,
Hmm.
are they really saying the results of these theories will be love, joy, peace? I mean, you have to just laugh at the whole thing. It's like, we are going in such the opposite direction of where Jesus told us we should go.
It's a great irony because
Yeah.
we we keep telling ourselves we're going to find this paradise, that some good, beautiful thing's going to happen, some mini utopia, maybe leading to the utopia, Marxist, for example. We just need more time. We need the revolution. We need to, the proletariat has to rise up, take control, and we have to go through a series of revolutions for that to happen. So more time, more time, more time. Meanwhile, no fruit.
More death, more
More
death,
death.
more death. Yes, absolutely.
And it applies to pedagogy. Progressive educators have been constantly promising, based on empirical research, data-driven research, that we can improve test scores and students' skills and ability and knowledge and ability to work better. And they've been promising us that for 100 years, usually
Well,
55-year cycles.
the test scores decline.
Yeah. But it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. And maybe that's reflective of another myth. Why is it that human beings can keep saying we should we should do X to get paradise when it has never yielded fruits? Like that's the definition some people would say of insanity, is doing the same thing and expecting different results. So there's something really key here. And I'd like to make a comment about, therefore, your myth of the imagined self. Because the myth of the imagined self seems to be the capstone of this kind of, I'll just call it corrupted utopianism. It's this idea that I really can be whatever I decide to be. And I can do that by, like an autonomous fiat. I now am X, and I am because I have thought it. And therefore you must acknowledge it. And not only that, commend me for this. Could you
Mhm.
comment on how we've gotten to this point of the imagined self, and maybe start talking about its implications for what we do in our schools?
Well, there's so many ways of approaching the imagined self. But one of the things to go back to the cogito, I think, therefore I am, right?
Mhm.
Now, if you take that statement at its face value, or if you take it as foundational to the myth of the imagined self, I can say I'm a woman. And for the first time in history, I'm making a credible, comprehensible statement.
Mhm.
You couldn't say that without Descartes. I mean,
Mhm.
who would ever believe you if you walked in with your plumbing all in order and said, I'm a woman? Like, no, you're crazy. Now you could say, I wish I were a woman.
Mhm.
I would prefer to be a woman. But to say I am a woman is insane. But what's differed, thanks to a lot of changes in our civilization, is, Nietzsche now, without God, there's no absolute,
Mhm.
and everything is permissible.
Mhm.
So I am permitted to say that. And now, with modern science and technology, maybe I can make changes to my body. We're back to Gnosticism because the mind is telling me the mind is what matters. My body is
Mhm.
irrelevant. Now I can make these changes to myself that will actually make me what I think I am.
Yeah.
And this is such a deep um, sickness. And I'm not saying that there are not persons who have a confused sexual identity or that don't suffer from uh, some deep uh, psychological confusion over who they are or what they aspire to be. I think there are people like that. I've known some people like that.
Mhm.
But how do you, the question we have to address is, what do you do about that? How do you help those people?
Mhm.
You put them in an operating chamber and cut them all up and try to make them externally what they think they are. I don't think that is going to work. It's just not going to work. I mean, that's not how they were created.
Mhm.
And I think there are ways, healthy ways, appropriate ways of addressing that, but probably not painless ways.
Mhm.
All of us we all have some psychological twists and turns to ourselves. And getting ourselves back right, or in a Christian sense, putting ourselves right with God, it's often painful and difficult. And in some cases, we just don't want to pay the price to do that.
Yeah.
And, uh, one of the things I also talk about in the book is the difference between what I call prescriptive norms, which is what you find in the garden myth, and descriptive norms, which is what we're trying to do in the modern world with the imagined self. We know we can't have a society without norms. It just becomes chaos. Everybody's doing their own thing. But what should those norms be? Well, we're rejecting the prescriptive norms, but we're trying to then design our own norms that uh, meet certain criteria. You know, it's good for me, it's good for my neighbor, it's good for society. We want these, let's take a norm like, norm I'm very guilty of, divorce. Okay. I went through a divorce. It's a terrible thing. It's something that I shouldn't do as a Christian. It's something I needed to be forgiven for. Uh,
Mhm.
but in my mind, and it was painful, both going through the divorce and then trying to confront my creator with that
Mhm.
prescriptive norm and trying to justify my own behavior and realizing I can't justify it. It was wrong. All I can do is confess it, plead for forgiveness, plead for mercy, and move on with my life. And
Mhm.
but that to me doesn't change the prescriptive norm. That doesn't suddenly we can say, oh, there's no fault divorce. No, divorce is fine. It's just a contract. We should be able to move from one partner to the other. No, that's the most unhealthy, dangerous thing, but that's where we are. And
Mhm.
it's hurting children, it's tearing up the family. It's it's a very but we're just simply not willing to say, and this is where, I talk about these proto-myths. The proto-myths are really clear about this. The problem wasn't that Adam and Eve ate the fruit. It's that they went and hid, avoided God. And instead of doing what the whole rest of the biblical narrative says you have to do, confess, repent, ask for forgiveness, and move on. The beautiful thing about our faith is it's a faith of second chances. This is why this is the whole beautiful story. Why the whole thing, of course, in St. Paul is saying, no, don't take advantage of this fact. The fact that it's a faith of second chances doesn't mean you go out and, you know, make all these bad decisions. There will be hard consequences of making these bad decisions. And not just the need to get down on your knees and beg for forgiveness. There are going to be ongoing, as there is with a divorce. When you divorce, it's not all over. The pain continues, the problems continue, and you just have to continue to work with them, address them, and plead for mercy.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't change, what we do with the imagined self is, oh, no, we can do whatever we want to do. We make the rules. And this is the Nietzschean thing, although, and then I'll shut up on this, but the one of the things I love about the book personally is I use Nietzsche and other anti-Christian or atheistic writers to support my thesis. Nietzsche's whole point about the madman in the Gay Science, he makes this whole point about the fact that, the bourgeois, you're not going to be willing to, people are going to continue to live as if God exists. And that's ridiculous. He doesn't exist, and they don't even believe he does, but they continue to live as if he does. He says someday these people are going to have the guts, the courage to live as if he doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, yes, we have seen that. We saw that with Lenin. We saw that with Hitler. We saw that with other notable, the whole Pol Pot business. Yeah, if you really have the strength of that, if you really absorb that knowledge, the enormity of that fact, and say, oh, yeah, I do make, there are no laws, there's no absolutes. I make the absolutes. I'm the Ubermensch. I control, I govern, and all the rest of these littler people, they need to pay attention to me. Well, we've got a world now that is full of people wanting to be Supermen. But the trouble is no one wants to be the little man, the guy who obeys, oh, you say those are the rules. Okay, I'll obey your rules. No, I want to make the rules. And this is, of course, how Justice Kennedy's famous statement comes into it, that, the Supreme Court is saying, well, everybody has the right to define existence for themselves, this broad, in other words, everyone has the right to be God. And I'm sure that Justice Kennedy, who's a good Catholic man, I'm sure he didn't intend for that kind of interpretation, but we're back to Descartes. We're back to people in influential positions and authority making inane statements that can easily be misinterpreted and play right into the zeitgeist. So anyway.
So this is so relevant to education, therefore, because education is well, among other things, it is an attempt to shape a soul to know what is real, to live in harmony with God and the cosmos he's created and the people that he's created. And so we're experiencing some great disorder because people, I think, are in increasing numbers becoming Nietzschean, or they're starting to live according to what they actually believe. And it's quite disturbing. And it's just, and people are recognizing this, but they don't have many or most of them the ability to know why. And so I think what your book does, among other things, is help us to understand why we are where we are right now. There is a mythic reason for why we have the kind of behaviors and thought that we do. And so David is laying that out for us. And so I think it's one of the great values of the book is it's a commentary on understanding why we are at the place we are now. And David, in your own book, you dedicate it to your children's children. And I know you've told me personally because you want your children's children to be able to look back on your life and understand the kind of signposts you were trying to put up, or if you will, why you built this wall the way you did, that's reflected in so many aspects of your life. So I'd like you to use the metaphor of the wall for us and talk about how this book is kind of a wall construction and how that might be a useful, analogy for any teacher, any student, because you argue in the book that that's what we're all doing, something like constructing a wall. And you use that as a positive metaphor, not walling off, not like making a fortress for yourself. And you can describe that. But before you do, I just want to invite our our participants to join us. And we're going to give you all the ability to turn on your cameras should you want to. You don't have to kind of show up, and then we'll launch the checkerboard, and then you can ask some questions and make some comments, yourself without even typing them in the box if you want to. If not, you can type them into the Q&A box that you see there at the bottom. But we'd like to finish up with your questions. So please engage David with anything you're curious about. And you'll see that either Jay or Courtney are going to be elevating you to the rank of panelists so that you can turn on your camera. So I think that's happening now. So if you want to turn on your camera and ask your question directly of David, I'll just invite you to do so. So who would like to be first? If so, turn on your camera and we will hear from you. And I'll give you about 15 seconds to do that. And if not, if no one appears, I'm going to just read Sylvia's question. I'm going to go ahead and read Sylvia's question. Oh, here she is. Excellent.
Hi there. Thank you. This has just been a fascinating discussion on mythos. I liked your title. So I am a biology teacher, and I actually use that verse when we think about the fossil records. And so I'm just curious why you chose that verse for the title of your book.
The stones cry out.
Yeah.
Well, first, because I love that story in Luke. To me, it's a very funny story because, and those of us who are familiar with the Gospels and read them many times, we fail, I think, to see how stunning, uh, what an original, stunning person Jesus Christ was. I mean, he said the most amazing things, and especially if you have some familiarity with the ancient world and what else was going on in the ancient world and who else was writing, and the whole gospel it just comes out of nowhere in terms of the ancient world. No wonder it had such a stunning effect on that world. But I love him coming down the hill. And the other thing is I've been a headmaster most of my life, and I know that lots of things are said behind your back that are not very flattering because you're doing something that people don't agree with or don't like or whatever. And I can just hear these Pharisees off on the side as they're coming down. Oh, look at him. He thinks he's God. He's accepting these plaudits from his followers. This is really disgraceful. It shows what a hypocrite, what a hypocrite he is. And he picks right up on it and he says, look, if these people weren't saying this, the stones would cry out. They'd be saying it. And so I choose the metaphor for the book because that's the stones, and this was back to sort of what Chris was saying. The stones are in the metaphor, they're sort of what I have experienced in my life, what I've read, what I've thought. And as Chris knows, I kept these little observations or reflections in the title in commonplace books that I wrote most of my life because I didn't have time to write books. I was very busy being a school administrator. A terrible thing to be, by the way. I would not just encourage anyone to do that. And so, but I wanted to keep sort of the gray matter turning over. So I would write in my commonplace books these little observations. And when I finished my life, and I had 10 of these books, and I had never read back into them. And I just sat down, I had time now, and I read my commonplace books, and that's where the idea emerged that, wow, these things kind of fall into these mythic patterns, and I could write a book about this. But the book itself is written, literally, I just pulled from my commonplace book, put things together, and that's why in the metaphor at the beginning, it's like, to me, building a wall. It's just, and as I say at the beginning, because I also do a lot of stonework here on the ranch, and I've learned that you don't build a wall by looking through a big pile of random stones and finding the best stone, the one you want to use. You'll never get the wall built that way, and it won't be a very good wall. You just pull the stone that comes to hand off the pile, and you find a place for it in your wall, because this is the magic of random rubble wall building. There's a place for every stone. You can't believe it, but they all have a place in that wall. And when it's finished, if you're much better than I am, you've got a really beautiful wall that everything is just in place. So that's sort of how I wrote the book. I just saw all these observations. That's why there's some repetition in it, because often, like the Stoics used to have a daily exercise where they went through a list of questions and would write an answer to those questions. And every 20 or 30 days, the questions would just repeat themselves, and they'd write another answer to that question. But the answer, of course, would change because they're not thinking about it in exactly the same way. And so that's also, that will describe kind of how discursive the book is. But there's a good thing about that. I don't know if you're familiar with Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. He kind of had to do the same thing. He was a very busy emperor, fighting those Germans that are always making trouble on the Danube, and so he couldn't. But every day, or he regularly wrote down his thoughts, possibly as a Stoic in response to these questions. But now, if we have the Meditations, which now this is a book that I'm going to pitch. You all should read my brother and my Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. They're almost giving it away. Everyone loves this book. They've sold about 500,000 copies. You will love it. It's a great the best translation in the market. But what's fun about that book is you can open it up anywhere and start reading, and Marcus is a very provocative thinker. He puts ideas down in a very interesting way. So you can just pick it up and read 2 or 3 of his thoughts, and be stimulated by them, be inspired. Well, I wanted in my book to have the same. You don't have to read through this book. You can just open it up, pick up one of the stones and read it and think, oh, that's interesting, or that's a bunch of nonsense. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, you can have a reaction to it. And because that's how, by the way, that's, I think, how most we don't read books anymore. This book is like, what is this book? 200, and this is almost 300 pages. No one reads books that are 300 pages long. I mean, I know Chris is a publisher. He's cringing when I say this, but people just don't do that anymore. Now, maybe if you just buy it and open it up and start reading here and there, you'll say, oh, maybe I will read this book. But you can read the book that way. You don't have to read from A to Z. Anyway,
Wonderful.
Thank you, Sylvia. I know I didn't answer your question, but anyway.
No, you did. Thank you.
I'm responding to your smile.
I'm looking forward to reading your rocks. It sounds great. Thank you.
You will. Interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
David, just one brief comment, and then we have a question from Joy Lynn. The fact that the wall is a random rubble wall, I think is suggestive that all of us live in light of God's providence, that you will have to build with what you're given, with what you find before you, given your circumstances of birth, education, family, country, language, so on. But you've been given enough to build something beautiful. And you can also learn from the walls built by others. So when David cites the Emperor's Handbook, which I teach that book in one class that I teach, it is a marvelous book. You can learn from the wall that Marcus Aurelius tried to build. And you'll note some things in that book that are actually truths that Christians can affirm, and some things that you cannot. But it's nonetheless really instructive. So thank you for that, David. We're all building walls. and we're all using stones that God has provided for us, and He has provided. Joylyn, what are you thinking?
Oh, thank you. It actually is great to tee up what I was thinking, and you probably have already answered it. But thank you, Chris. Thank you, David, so much for everything you've shared. It's such good food for thought. And I guess what I'd love to hear you reflect aloud a little more on is given the fact that there are these kind of four dominant myths, and given the fact that any one of those myths has had varying levels of dominance in a culture, in society, or in a time period, um, I'm not exactly asking you to be a prophet, but sort of. I'm asking you to say, um, do you think the religious myth will enjoy dominance again, or it already does, or that shouldn't even be our concern, that our concern is a matter of just fruit bearing in our own lives and being attentive enough to the work of our hands and the stones in our hands to ready them for our children's children. But to determine whether or not a particular myth has sway in the greater or larger storyline, isn't our concern, or is it? I just want to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll go back to Ayn Rand, who's an atheist, but this is why I tried to use atheists to promote my idea. But, yeah, we've evaded reality. Three of those myths, in my view, the myth of reason, the myth of science, the myth of the imagined self, are just evading reality. They're just trying to pretend that things are not what they are. And as she said, you can't evade the consequences of evading reality. As a convinced Christian, there's no question to me that at the end of the day, Christ will come again. The whole world has been made new through his death and resurrection, through the incarnation. And that is reality. And all the rest of this stuff but it's going to lead us into a terrible time. I don't know if you've read, have you read the book? It's a novel, The Canticle for Leibowitz, where all there's left is this little monastery that's still holding on to the truth, but it's surrounded by Mad Max and all of his nonsense. Okay. And I think things are going to get really bad. If I'm going to be prophetic about it, I don't think that the world is suddenly going to embrace the gospel again, and I don't think that the critical theorists are going to say, we've made a big mistake. We should be developing theories that give rise to the virtues that Paul talks about. That's not going to happen. People are completely wedded to this is the other theme I have in the book, and if you've read it, Jocelyn, you know this. People find believable what they believe. I mean, that's just the truth. And so people who are materialists, I mean, they are committed materialists. Richard Dawkins believes what he believes. He thinks it's believable. I have a whole section in the book where I talk about Dr. O'Neill, right? A very famous kind of science messiah guy who goes around and tries to convince people that science is the answer. I tell you, he was on 60 Minutes, and I used just the clip of his on 60 Minutes. And what I try to say is, if you look at that, it's just nonsense. What he's saying, but he's so eloquent and he's so persuasive, and his audience is laughing at all of his jokes. And you're thinking, really? That didn't make any sense, what he just said. One of the things he says, if we had a cosmic perspective, if we understood, what Earth looks like from outer space, or we had a more scientific perspective, there'd be no more wars. Huh? I mean, what has that got to do with there being no more wars? He's not dealing, as Solzhenitsyn would, with what's going on inside the human heart. Science has nothing to do with that. So, no, I wouldn't worry. I mean, I think your answer is the right answer. I think teach your children and pray. And you look, I experienced despair too. I look at what's going on and I just like, I don't even watch the news now. It's just too depressing. And I started my life, in politics. I was going to fight the world's fight. Well, I admire those who try to do that, but I don't see that. There's not, we say in the liturgy, put not your trust in princes and in sons of men in whom there is no salvation. There is no salvation in us, right? And unless we understand that profoundly, and we look with charity on one another, but not to be saved by someone else, we're just falling into the trap of these modern myths. It's a hard thing because for our children, these are the myths they're growing up with. And they're finding, and because our myths is fabulous, and that's why I try to be honest in the book about it. These are fabulous myths. I mean, C.S. Lewis recognized that, Tolkien recognized that, but of course they said only a fabulous myth makes any sense, because life is fabulous, or life is a miracle. Wendell Berry, right?
How would you, this gets to perhaps this could be our last question, but Crystal has a question. How would you confess that the proto-myths communicate deep human truths and that they're inspired and that the church has received them and the church is to be obedient to them? I know that's your view. And yet you're also willing to say maybe there wasn't a literal Adam and Eve. You don't think the myths depend on that to do the work that they do for us as believers in Christ. But that can be a challenge to hear to folks who are quite convinced that there is a literal Adam and Eve. So how do you respond to that question?
Well, to all questions like that, I mean, my response is, if you believe that, that's great. I mean, I'm not arguing with you. I don't want you to, if you take a very literal view of those myths, there really was a talking serpent. There really was a tree that you plucked knowledge off of. I mean, if you take a very literal view of that, I'm not going to argue with you. As I say in the book, it's not the interpretations that matter, it's the story. And we need to keep that story in front of ourselves. Interpretation is not scripture. The story is scripture. And the story is there to be, the more I mean, I've spent my whole life with those stories, right? And what my book is what I've taken personally from those stories. But what I'm trying to say in the book constantly, and Chris made the point with, we all ought to be building our own stone walls. We ought to be taking these stories and trying to understand them in a deeper, more spiritual level, and be made better by those stories. And we can read what the church fathers have to say. We can read what N.T. Wright has to say. We can read, modern theologians, C.S. Lewis, whoever. That's good. That's helpful. But it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter to the whole. I mean, I have my own views about, for example, evolution, but I don't want to get into those in the book because to me, that's a red herring. I mean, God could have created us any way he wanted to. And for us to assume that he did something in a time period we can't even grasp or understand, we're just assuming knowledge we don't have. We know that he created us. We know that he created we know that he created a moral universe. We know that he created things beautiful and good, because that's what our story tells us. So how that looks and why there's evil in the world, the story gives us answers to that, but it doesn't, but it leaves it up to us to accept those answers and work them out in our own lives. which I think is a beautiful thing. It's a lovely thing. What if, let me pause another, what if the whole thing had begun with, Genesis 1 had begun with a proposition, and then had logically argued from that proposition, told us exactly everything that we should believe and exactly what happened a million years ago, or 400 or 4,004 years ago, whatever. What if it had done that? I mean,
Yeah, it's similar to, your comments about Jesus speaking to the tree.
yeah,
The literal truth is when he rebuked the fig tree, it did wither.
yeah,
But the larger truth is something that we think about forever. Do I bear fruit? Do the Pharisees bear fruit? What if I don't bear fruit? What if someone says one thing but does another? How should we understand that person? Um, and what do we do with the parables of Christ as well? Christ talks about Lazarus and a rich man. He talks about a sower sowing a field and so on. So I think I'm just, for Crystal's sake, for a lot of centuries there were a fourfold method that many church theologians used to look at Scripture, and one was the literal. That okay, let's take this literally, and what do we derive from that? What edifies us if we interpret this story as literally true? But then they also ask a question: what if it's morally true? What if it's spiritually true? And then another question became, is this a part of an ongoing archetypal theme that we see? So when you start thinking about, well, what does a tree mean in Scripture? We have the tree in the garden, and then we have the tree in Psalm 1, that the blessed man is like a tree whose leaves don't wither, planted by streams of water. We're supposed to be apparently blessed like a tree. And then there's the tree that comes down from heaven in the end of the book of Revelation. I think there are these multiple levels, and at least David is saying all of those levels can be edifying. And one thing that David is not saying is that if Adam and Eve did not exist as literal human beings, it doesn't mean that he doesn't believe in creation, and it doesn't mean that he doesn't believe that God has created us and has authority over us, and that we have all fallen in sin. Which is typically what you probably hear when someone says, "Well, I don't believe in a literal Adam and Eve. Therefore, there's not necessarily a fall, and there's not necessarily a creator God." Well, that's a big topic that continually gets discussed, and we don't have time to resolve that now, to be sure.
well,
David, sir, yeah, could give you the concluding comments. What would you like to say about that? And then, if you would just maybe let if people want to know more, want to know more about how to hear from you, read your writing, be in contact with you. Is there anything you would share with our viewers?
well, I'm always happy to. I love it when people send me an email and comment about some aspect of what I've written, either with a question or with a disagreement. Why did you say this? To Chris's point, why aren't these things real? I think that's why Chris read my definition of a mythos. Uh, yeah, a myth doesn't have to be. A myth is not a literal thing. It was not, we have trouble sort of getting back into a mindset that's thousands of years old, and yet for many, the myths were literal. I mean, the story has to stand. It has to be repeated. It has to go to everybody. And whether they accept it as something that actually did happen, or they feed on it and say, oh, there are really truths in this story that that are profound. I just don't lose any energy over that, and I think to try to divide ourselves, if someone wants to be a literalist, I'm great, brother, be a literalist. That's fantastic. I'm cool with that. I want my children to be literalists, that's for sure. They're going to hear the story many times. Um, but on the other hand, when some science, when they carbon date something and say, wait a second, the Earth is more than 4,000 years old. Well, yeah, probably is. I mean, It, it just couldn't come. And my view of God is that God isn't a guy who kind of hides all those fossils and everything else in order to make it look older than it really is. I mean, that's just, to me, that makes no sense. But on the other hand, I don't see any reason to worry about that. I mean, our problem is someone wrote a book, Your God is Too Small. I mean, our God is, and I write about this in the book, we can't even begin to imagine. I mean, God is a placeholder for something that is so much grander and more amazing. We just can't even approach that. And we need to understand, when we're worshiping God, our knowledge of God comes, as Christians, it comes through his gift of his Son. And that's what we really know of God. But we also know him through his energies, what he's done. And that goes back to these proto-myths. God did these things, and he made these things good and beautiful. And that gives us a lot of running room in terms of how we're going to compose our lives and what we're going to do with our lives. But above all, we need to seek goodness. We need to seek beauty. And we come back to, we'll end this conversation, Chris, back to the house. Blasted classical. I mean, I really love people who make things beautiful, because our whole story is a beautiful story. And it's the beauty in the story that wins us. It's not the logic of it. Anyway, I think this has been enjoyable for me too. I want to thank everyone for their attentiveness. I know how hard it is to listen to someone blather on for a long time. And so thank you very much. And thank you for reading the book. And let me hear from you if you've got some thoughts to share.
Yeah. Is it okay if I put your email address in the chat box for folks?
Sure. Yeah. Yes, of course.
That way it won't go out to the entire world, but there it is for those of you who'd like to correspond with David who are on this call. Thank you, David, as always. Thank you for writing this book and for all the building you've been doing in various ways. And I just, again, refer people to the video if you want to kind of see the story and get to see this lovely house that David and his wife were able to construct. Take a look at that. He's also been very generous. He has acquired some beautiful property in Montana. He's giving it to a monastery. And so you can see this monastery that is being built, weekly.
Chris, have you heard we have an abbot?
No, that's great.
Yes, the Lord just gave us an abbot. He's the person we've been hoping for years would accept this challenge, and his name is Papa Ephraim. He's just a beautiful soul, and we're so excited that he's going to take hold of this monastery, and I have huge confidence that it is going to be a God-pleasing, wonderful work in the world, and it will touch the lives of many young men, I hope.
That's wonderful. The video, this little documentary you did will show you some scenes of that monastery being constructed, also with a lot of stones. Well, thank you everyone for your kind attention and for the work that you're doing in your own fields. We really appreciate and love you, even though we don't know you. We feel that kinship with you. So have a wonderful and blessed afternoon or evening or morning, depending on the time zone you're in. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.